I want to welcome all of you. This is such an unusual way for us to begin district conference. Hey, Keith, nice to see you. Welcome. But it's exciting. We were just talking about some of the advantages of gathering this way. And the drive to McPherson was just grand for me, meaning that it wasn't. So I sit here in my Colorado house and I welcome each one of you from your various personal places. If you want the CEUs, put the request in the chat box with your name, and Leslie or Joanna can answer questions if you have questions about that. And I'm just going to jump right in here now and welcome Jonathan from Greensboro, North Carolina. He has put together this workshop just for us on radical pietism in radical times. I read one of Jonathan's articles in Messenger. It was just over a year ago, and I was quite taken by it. So I called him up and we talked. He sent me some additional writing that he had been doing in terms of exploring our radical pietist heritage. And everything that he said just really resonated with my own personal exploration and wonderings about our pietist heritage. So I used that to build my theme for this district conference on reclaiming our pietistic heritage. So I'm really excited to have this extended time. We have a couple hours here for thinking and listening with Jonathan. And additionally, you will have the opportunity to experience some other gifts that he has later on today in this conference. He has an organ recital, and I encourage you to show up for that because it's great. So Jonathan, welcome. How's North Carolina?
North Carolina is great. Thanks so much for having me. I was sharing a little bit earlier that I'm thankful that the weather is what it is today and is not what it was yesterday. I kept losing power yesterday in the middle of terrible thunderstorms. So it is bright and sunny, and barring some technological failures, I don't think I'll lose you today. So I'm glad to be here, and I want to thank Vicki for the invitation and for the opportunity to really just to share what for me has kind of been a round of about, I would say, stumbling into so much of what I've come to, so much of what I've been exploring, so many of the connections that I feel like in some ways have just been made through me, not by me. So I want to start there and maybe back up and just give you a brief history of that stumbling. I don't know, maybe about 5 or 6 or so years ago, I will say stumbled into sort of a contemplative stance. I found myself at a place in life where I was mostly questioning vocation, but found myself sort of opening and listening more in ways that I, in a lot of ways, wasn't even aiming to. And so while I grew up in the Church of the Brethren and have been connected, sometimes more so than others, my profession as a church musician has taken me to various denominations. I serve at a United Methodist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, right now as the director of their music ministries. I've always sort of hung tight with the denomination. My membership is still at my home church. I've continued to play at annual conferences and at NOACs as the organist. And so I've been able to stay connected, and I'm thankful for that, and still have many friends who are tried and true brethren. But I will say that my stumbling into radical pietism was kind of a backdoor stumble. After that initial sort of contemplative stance, I'll call it, I discovered Richard Rohr, a Franciscan who founded in Albuquerque, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, who founded the Center for Action and Contemplation. More on that at the very end. But out of that center, which he founded in the 1980s, in the last 5 or 6 years, he, along with a few other teachers, have developed a 2-year curriculum that they call the Living School. Joanna, you're out there somewhere. Where are you? Maybe on a different screen. Anyway, Joanna and I entered that two-year program in the same cohort. So that was 2015 to 2017. And for me, that was me exploring and sort of following a nudge to go deeper into the place that I'd already found myself falling. I found myself reading Richard Rohr's writings and sort of approach to theology. I found that resonating very much with where I was. It was as if he was speaking things into my life that were already there. There was just sort of a resonance and a connection that I can't describe any other way. And so I embarked on that 2-year study, and I will say that as I was going through that program and as I was experiencing life as it was sort of coming at me, and as I was sort of looking at our denomination, and although this is not unique to our denomination, looking at the ways that our conservative bent and our progressive bent often come to a head, where places where impasses that we seem to reach, I will say, I increasingly found myself viewing contemplative spirituality as kind of a third force, a third way that in my view would unlock so many of our theological conundrums, that would resolve so many of our disagreements, that would take the best from conservatism, that would take the best from progressivism, and bring us to a different place, at least in theory. And then as I sort of traveled through these 2 years of this program, we studied various mystics and various contemplatives, and sort of the whole development of that lineage for centuries. As we got to one of our last units, I'll never forget this. One of the teachers in the program presented us a unit on Jakob Böhme, who I knew nothing about. And then all of a sudden she made mention of the Anabaptists who picked him up. She made the point that the Catholics didn't want him and the Protestants didn't really want him, but there was this radical group in the middle, so to speak, that seemed interested. And so then the fireworks started to go off, and I thought to myself, what has happened? I've been following this path really circuitously, and here I am back at the very beginning of, or at that, maybe at the headwaters of my own tradition. And so I use all of that as an introduction to this. And so let me see, this will be my maiden voyage screen sharing. So we'll see how this goes. And if you want to share questions, because once the screen is shared, I'm sure I won't be able to see everybody. If you want to share questions in the chat, I'll try, and I can't even promise that I'll find them there, but I'll do my best. So here's the screen share. And I trust that you see the presentation, yes? Okay, great. So for me, as you know, our denomination, but not just our denomination, if you've read any of Phyllis Tickle and the Great Emergence and all of that, you know that we're just beyond that 500-year mark, where it's time to have our 500-year mark after the Reformation, and it's time to have our rummage sale. So where are we as a broad church? And maybe those questions are in even greater relief during the age of COVID, but where's our denomination too? And so I'm glad Vicki has taken this tact for this conference. And so what can we retrieve from our tradition? Not just to be traditionalist and not just to do things because they've always been that way, but what is locked up in our tradition that we might retrieve? And so my thesis, you won't be surprised, is that in fact the heart of our brethren tradition is contemplative. And I want to read something by way of getting this started. Just a reflection that I wrote a week or so ago. Let me just read this with you. As I write this reflection, we citizens of the earth are discovering our interconnectedness with increasing, perhaps horrifying, clarity. The intensifying fallout from the spread of COVID-19 has made manifest the ways in which our actions directly and observably impact our brothers and our sisters, most specifically those who are vulnerable, susceptible, and weak. On a more subtle level, our nation's renewed focus on racial injustice highlights an even more indicting reality. The ways we perceive, posture, and position in the world have measurable, observable, heartbreaking outcomes. We are woven together, and the weave seems tighter than ever. The consequences of our actions, our emotions, and our reactions are real, and the stakes have never seemed higher. With this planetary overview in place, a call to contemplation is timely and desperately needed. I suspect some would quickly contend that contemplation seems an awfully tone-deaf proposal in 2020, a time that demands response and action, not quiet reflection. Is contemplation any more helpful, one might ask, in a quarantined, racially charged America than have been our thoughts and prayers on the landscape of our nation's immovable politics on gun control? The answer here is resounding, but not simple. Contemplatives, it seems, have a lot of explaining to do. In his book titled The New Creation in Christ, Christian Meditation and Community, B.D. Griffiths explores the ways in which Benedictine Father John Main successfully revived the somewhat lost tradition of contemplative prayer for Christians today. Griffiths explains that, quote, contemplative prayer begins when all discursive thought ceases and when the mind rests in silence in the presence of God. Indeed, contemplation is traditionally described as a stance of surrender, a posture in which one makes himself in solitude and in stillness available to God. Language like this has often led bystanders to misunderstand contemplation as an introvert's paradise, or as the process by which men and women have become too heavenly minded for earthly good, as the old saying goes. But the wager of contemplation is much greater. And I'll put a ... there and come back to that in a little while. But I just wanted to set that up, and to just by way of saying that contemplation, rightly viewed and rightly understood, is much more than simply sitting in your quiet cell by yourself praying. And so take that with us as we go. But if this is my thesis, and I'll come back to that in a bit, then my proposal is this. That we, at this time, this liminal space, this sort of time of change, this time of where do we go from here, this time of compelling vision even, is that we are called to radically repietize our Anabaptism. And so that's where we'll go today. I want to go back to 1708, maybe a little bit before 1708, just to talk a bit about our beginnings and to provide what for some might be a reassessment. For some, this might not be new at all, and that's okay too. But of course, if you took a poll, a brethren poll, and the question was, who is our founder? We would all say Alexander Mack. Alexander Mack's on NOAC News all the time and on COB News or Annual Conference News in more recent years, but he's our man, so to speak. But interestingly, there is some increasing and growing Brethren scholarship, which I also stumbled into, particularly by Scott Holland, who's at Bethany Theological Seminary, and by Ken Rogers too. Both of them have worked and have started to discover that yes, Alexander Mack is our institutional organizational founder, no question about it. He led the 8. But one of his close colleagues, Ernst Christian Hochmann von Hochenau, complete contemporary, born in the same decade, could be construed or could be attributed to be Mack's close colleague who in some ways was responsible for the spiritual awakening of some of the first brethren, and maybe the spiritual founder of our movement. And so Scott Holland has recently published an article, just published this summer, I think, in a periodical, Brethren Perspectives. And the title of his article is, "Have the Brethren Traded Love Pietism for Anabaptist Discipline?" And so Scott takes the approach of Martin Luther's 95 theses approach, except Scott only has 9 theses in his article. And so this excerpt here below Ernst or Hochmann's name, this is a quote from that article, and the title again, "Have Brethren Traded Love Pietism for Anabaptist Discipline?" And I'll read this to you. "The claim that Hochmann was the spiritual founder is not to deny that Alexander Mack," that bracket should have extended a little further, "is not to deny that Alexander Mack, in fact, became the institutional founder and the organizational leader of the Brethren. It is rather to remind us that there are spiritual and social histories that our formal institutional histories often exile, de-emphasize, or omit." And from what I've learned mostly from Scott's writing and research, is that soon after the Brethren movement began to take on more formal structures, soon after sorts of disciplines began to be established, Hochmann objected, and we'll come back to some of that a little bit later, but Hochmann objected and saw that as sort of a quenching of the spirit, and retreated from the movement and spent most of the rest of his life, the next, I guess, 10 or so, the last decade of his life, practicing spiritual direction from his own hut, as it were. And so I think the question that we need to ask, if this scholarship is true, is what may we have lost as a movement at its beginnings? What may we have lost when Hochmann and Mack parted ways? And the better question, and the more contemporary question, might be, is our current institutional structure inspired and undergirded by Hochmann's spirituality, or does it block or hinder it, or does it not know about it, or does it choose to ignore it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so what would we regain, metaphorically speaking, if we revisited Hochmann's hut? What if we went to Hochmann for spiritual direction now? What would he say? What would he say to us? And if we have indeed held on to our Mac-based organizational history, then what segments of our spiritual history have we omitted, or have we lost, or have we exiled? Much of Hochmann's writing is in German and is not translated, and is in German libraries. We do, however, have ready access to the writings of Gottfried Arnold, who was a colleague, a contemporary of Hochmann. This is a passage from, do I have the book with me? From Pietist Classics. It's a collection of Pietist writings. And in the introduction, Gottfried Arnold is, you can see his dates are very much the same as Hochmann and very much the same as Mack. Arnold is given credit as being one of the chief influencers of Hoffmann, who, as you read, was a central figure in the establishment of our denomination, of the Brethren movement. And so I think many of you probably know Arnold and perhaps his work, Die erste Liebe, or The First Love. I know that that's widely read in German Baptist Brethren circles, The First Love. And so we'll explore him just a little bit today. Before we go there, though, we can't really go to Arnold without talking a little bit about wisdom with a capital W. One of Arnold's seminary or seminal works is a piece titled "The Mystery of Divine Wisdom," and it's of course written in German, but "The Mystery of Divine Wisdom." And so I want to talk a little bit about the wisdom tradition, where that comes from, how it's really part of Christianity. It is not a non-Christian notion, and how that will help us to get back to Arnold. And so in order to do that, I want to read a few passages from a book titled "The Wisdom Way of Knowing." This is a book by Cynthia Bourgeot. She is an Episcopal priest. She was one of the teachers in Richard Rohr's Living School. So she's somebody I know Joanna knows quite well, because we interacted with her on a regular basis when we were out in Albuquerque for those, off and on, for those 2 years. So here's what Cynthia Bourgeot says about wisdom. One of the greatest losses in our Christian West, and that the distinction is important there, Christian West versus Christian East, where this has not been lost to nearly the degree that it has in the Western Church. One of the greatest losses in our Christian West has been the loss of memory, in fact, almost a collective amnesia, about our own wisdom heritage. Many people hearing about wisdom imagine that I am describing an alien tradition, unaware that the first title given to Jesus by his immediate band of followers was Moshel Meshalim, which is translated Master of Wisdom. In the Near Eastern culture into which Jesus was born, this category was well known, and his methods were immediately recognizable as part of it. He taught parables and wisdom sayings. He came to help people awaken. But awakening is not that easy, and as a teacher or master of wisdom, Jesus had mixed success. As the four Gospels all record, some people glimpsed what he was saying while others missed it altogether. Some people got it part of the time and missed it the rest. Some people woke up and others remained asleep. Which leads us back to the point I was making earlier. This is still Cynthia talking. And then a little bit later, she goes on. If you've been raised a Christian, chances are you've never heard of the wisdom tradition, at least in the way I've just described it. This is still Cynthia. When theologians and biblical scholars talk about wisdom, they are almost always referring to a set of books in the Old Testament that emerged around and after the time of Israel's exile in Babylon, and reflect the influence of this exposure to Babylonian culture. This includes the Book of Wisdom, which is in the apocryphal books, which is not in all canonical, not in the canon, but also Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and some of the later Psalms. What doesn't seem to be sufficiently recognized is the fact that during the 40 years in Babylon, Israel was exposed not just to an influence, but to a school, a wisdom school. Ancient Babylon was one of the prominent centers of wisdom teaching, perhaps the most powerful school of its time. And the very atmosphere there must have been electric with receptivity to higher meaning, 5 centuries after this, in what some would claim as the fulfillment of visionary expectations. The Israelite culture was blown wide open by its second profound encounter with wisdom in the person of Jesus Christ. Those who could recognize Jesus saw him for what he was, a master of wisdom, teaching a science of transformation that was both ancient and timeless. While it remains a matter of speculation whether Jesus emerged from these ancient wisdom schools in the sense of having been a formal student, he certainly came and emerged through them, for the teaching he brought and embodied conforms itself perfectly to the vessel of wisdom. For that earliest generation who heard him and traveled with him, the encounter was truly a wisdom event, in that, as I spoke of earlier, it required a participative knowledge, a recognition from deep within. Who do you say that I am? Was Jesus' favorite question, whether spoken or implied. And the entire dynamism of the Gospels hangs on this drama of recognition. Who or what is it in a person that recognizes? This is an important question to keep in mind as we begin our exploration of wisdom in the chapters ahead. Remember, this is still Cynthia. Remember back in those earliest days along the shores of the Sea of Galilee and in Jerusalem, the outcome of this drama was completely unknown. The crucifixion and the resurrection still lay out in the future. So it wasn't possible to recognize this master of wisdom, Jesus, out of enlightened self-interest, as in getting aboard the winning team. The recognition had to come from something much more spontaneous and intimate, from a meeting of hearts in the present moment that somehow conferred full knowledge and consent. As the modern wisdom teacher Bruno Barnhart points out, Jesus' power as a master of wisdom then and now rests on his ability to awaken that which lies at the core of my being. There is a deep and pristinely clear something in each one of us, regardless of the outer circumstances of our lives, that has the capacity to recognize wisdom when we meet it. And it is the nature of wisdom teaching to call this something forth. And so that's a lot from Cynthia, but I think it's important to have that biblical and traditional framework for wisdom as we move forward a little bit into Arnold and link it all back to contemplation. And so I want to put on your screen a few quotes from a recent sermon that I found written by a brother at the monastery in New England, Massachusetts. The monastery is the Society of St. John the Evangelist. But his sermon is titled The Vindication of Wisdom. And I think it speaks about wisdom in sort of a contemporary sense. And so I just want to share a few passages from his sermon. And let me see if I can move your faces so I can read this. Okay. So you can read, but I will read to you. There are some who listen and follow, who find her dwelling, and her is the personification of wisdom. So her is wisdom. There are some who listen and follow, who find her dwelling and hold her fast. But there are many in the broad places of the world who ignore her. The marketplace, the world, is for many things, but not for wisdom. They don't bother to look up from their tiny screens. Nimble fingers text and tweet faster than hearts can pause and feel. And then another passage later. In the Gospel of Matthew and John, we bear witness to a spirit-led conversation between this multifaceted tradition of wisdom and the early Christian experience of Jesus Christ. For us as for them, wisdom is Jesus, the embodiment of all good things in wisdom's treasury and the incarnation of God, the source and the ground of wisdom, logos. This Jesus is without a doubt a savior to be worshiped and an exemplar of how we are to act in the world. But he is also a teacher of the heart, what today we are calling inner work. And hold on to all these references to heart. That'll come back. And then this last passage, a more lengthy one. This Jesus has immediate bearing on you and I, because the church in exile, and we are in somewhat of an exile today, has a precious opportunity to further become a school of wisdom, a training ground, a laboratory, even a boot camp for the inner work of the Spirit. We are stuck in between, in liminal space, some would say. We are stricken in conscience. We overflow with questions. We contend with demons. These circumstances are compelling us toward inner work. I like that word, compelling, for us these days, whether we like it or not. Here are just some of the questions I hear followers of Jesus asking, both beyond the monastery from where he writes and within it. How can I learn to be still? How can I make peace with the solitude I did not choose? Quarantine. How can I help my neighbor? How can I overcome the racism etched on my bones by my ancestors? How should we live? What does God desire? How is God involved? How can I love a God who is so mysterious? What is the church called to become? These are the questions of those who hunger and thirst for wisdom. These are questions that, asked with the right depth of intention over a lifetime, make saints. An invaluable orientation for living these questions through with depth, integrity, and faith is the portrait of wisdom. And so with wisdom sort of set up in that way, I want to turn back to Gottfried Arnold, and particularly to excerpts from his The Mystery of Divine Wisdom. And I sort of want to break it down into a few different wisdom categories, if you will. So first, Gottfried Arnold and his notion of the loss of wisdom, and these are all passages directly from an English translation of his The Mystery of the Divine Wisdom. And here's what Arnold says about wisdom in light of the garden and in light of original sin, perhaps. Although this wisdom was taken away through sin and no longer dwelt in the corrupted man in a paradisaical manner, nevertheless, she, wisdom, did not cease to speak to each child of Adam internally in their hearts. There's heart again. Internally in their hearts to bid them reestablish the lost treasure. And not distant from you, this is wisdom. Wisdom is not distant from you, but is able and wishes to be much closer to you than you are to yourself. So wisdom, this indwelling energy, this indwelling current that is perhaps closer to us than we are to ourselves as we live through our alienation from the garden and are working our way back. The loss of wisdom, followed by the call of wisdom, still from the same source. Arnold says, it is nothing other than a soft and loving breath and inner word in the soul, which comes to the soul unlooked for and unsought if it is internally still, the soul. Indeed, it is so subtle and peaceful an inner word that it can be put out with the smallest outbreak of gross nature in word or works, indeed, even by thoughts, which otherwise in themselves might not be evil. And so for Arnold, this speaking of wisdom into our lives, this thing that is closer to us than we are to ourselves, this speaking comes through stillness. It comes through, I would say it comes beneath thoughts. It is a thing that thoughts disturb. It is somehow not a rational thing. It is somehow a thing which is deeper, beyond logic, beyond reason. he also says, in this first seeking of wisdom, wisdom's proposal is nothing other than a divine call to obedience. And I'll talk a little bit later about the nature of obedience, and it's probably different than we are used to thinking about obedience. But that's the call of wisdom. Last here, one ought not to strive for it outside of oneself, but in the inner ground in which wisdom first testifies to itself. At the same time, one is to step down with one's will and to sink into wisdom. This will come back a little bit in tomorrow night's worship service. Lay me low will be a theme that you'll hear. Stepping down with one's will and sinking into wisdom. And then the return to wisdom. So the call of the departure from wisdom, wisdom's call, and now our return to wisdom. The first, again, still Arnold, the first and cheapest grade which leads us to wisdom is a pure heart. And we'll talk about purity of heart in a bit, free from all lower things. And for the man who wishes to receive wisdom, however, an open and prepared heart is required. Hold on again to all these heart references. And so we can think about the work of wisdom in the Christian journey, in the Christian life, through this theological pattern of Arnold. And again, this is all summarized in this Spiritual Classics, the collection of writings, on the collection of Pietist writings. And so this is a sort of a summary of Gottfried Arnold's Christian journey. The breaking of the heart is first, and you hear Arnold focusing a lot on heart space, which we'll come around to. So the breaking of the heart, the changing of the heart, the preparation of the heart. Notice he's talking a lot about heart and a lot less about mind. Faith arising from divinely inspired prayer. Purification which grows from renewal. And new life as a natural result of divine birth, from which flows fruit of the Spirit, which connects us right on back to Vicky's theme this week. So breaking of the heart, faith arising from divinely inspired prayer, purification growing from this renewal, from this rising faith, and new life as natural result of divine birth, producing fruit of the Spirit. Okay, so I've thrown this heart word around a lot, and I keep asking you to hold on to the heart. And so I want to talk a little bit about the epistemology of the heart. Epistemology meaning the science of knowing, or the way that the heart knows. And I want to suggest that we are pretty disconnected from our hearts. I want to start by saying, though, that I don't want you to think about heart as the center of our emotions. I don't want you to think about heart as this sentimental, romantic, easily swayed, easily broken piece of us. That would not be the heart that I'm suggesting, not at all. Instead, I want us to think about heart as the organ of spiritual perception, as the part of us that knows spiritual things spiritually, and so we have to recognize that as people formed as Westerners, that we are victims in some ways of the Enlightenment. And of Descartes' notion, I think, therefore I am, right? So that's sort of Descartes' famous little line, right? I think, therefore I am. But the fact of the matter is, this is a pretty big misstep, and we know that that's not true. We are much more than our thoughts. We there is much more to us than our rational, um, reasoning selves. The mind, as it were, operates by dividing things. And so the mind likes to make, the mind likes to separate, the mind likes to count, the mind likes to say good or bad, the mind likes to say right or wrong, the mind likes to say mine and yours. And that's how the mind makes sense of the world. The mind counts, the mind judges, the mind projects. And we talked a bit ago about wisdom and this way of knowing, and the way that Jesus taught. And it is in fact Jesus' parables, and Jesus' sayings that were designed to get us to think, for lack of a better word, differently, to overcome the duality of the way that we think, to overcome the way that we divide, to sort of catapult us, to carry us into a different way of conceiving of reality, and therefore of experiencing reality, to sort of reprogram us, as Cynthia Bourgeault would often say, to change our operating system. There is plenty that is good about the mind. It enables us to think for ourselves and to act in this world. But there is plenty about our mind that gets us in trouble. And so if we can use Jesus' teachings, and if we can think of Jesus as moving us from this dualistic way of thinking, conservative, progressive, pietist, Anabaptist, all these things that we sort of divide, if we can use Jesus' wisdom teachings as a way to move beyond this duality and to move toward what I would just offer up as a paradigm of purity. If you think back to the Beatitudes, you know the one, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. As I said before, the heart is not the center of passions and emotions and personality, but rather the ancients, in fact, thought that the passions and the emotions divided the heart. And so it is from a place of the undivided heart that we can perceive beyond duality, where we bring contradictions and paradoxes, which is so much of what our Christianity is, back together, and to see God from that place of wholeness rather than a place of constant dividing. And so how do we get from our minds to our heart? So just a few words that sometimes get misidentified and I think misrepresented, but I think they speak within our tradition to this movement from the mind to the heart, or from the incorporation of the mind into the heart. Metanoia, the word that we know and that translates to repentance most often, right? We talk about this word, Jesus says, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The way we translate this word, though, I think misses the mark a lot of the time. Rather than thinking of metanoia as repentance, or rather than thinking of repentance as a change of behavior, or of a turning around and going in the opposite direction, the word meta meaning larger or beyond, and the fragment noia, mind, would suggest that metanoia really means moving into the larger mind, or moving beyond the logical, beyond the rational, into something that is bigger, into something that is more heart centered, more heart focused. I mentioned the divide between the Eastern and the Western Church early on when I was reading from Cynthia's wisdom reflections. The Eastern Orthodox Church has never quite moved into the dualistic way of thinking of faith and of perceiving the differences between humanity and divinity as the West has. And so in the Eastern Orthodox Church is the tradition and the practice of recollection, which is really all about pulling the mind into the heart, as they would say, letting the mind drop into the heart. Sort of front and center in the Eastern Orthodox Church is the notion of divinization or theosis. And it resonates a lot with what Gottfried Arnold, with his theology in terms of our divine birth and continuing to find perfection, or to move toward what we read in Psalms and what we read in John, and you see those passages there, to move into our divine nature. And I know that seems blasphemous, but those passages would suggest that that while we are created in God's image, our likeness can be further and further refined, and we can be further and further sanctified. And so this heart space for the Eastern Orthodox Church has never left them like it has left the Western Church, which is so driven by thought, logic, systematizing, and theology done that way. It's a much more contemplative, mystical theology that the Eastern Church has maintained. And then the last note that I'll make here has to do with conscience, something we talk about all the time as a church that values dissent. Conscience, the closest word in Hebrew, translates as heart mind, and so already we've got something going on there, this connection between the heart and the mind. And the word that Paul uses in the New Testament in the Greek to talk about conscience is this inner knowledge, and that comes from that word is also found in Ecclesiastes, which is again part of that wisdom tradition that is sort of buried in our Old Testament. So all these themes, repentance, divine birth, conscience, they all find their way back if we dig hard enough, and if we follow the language well enough. They all find their way back to this wisdom tradition, to this deeper way of perceiving, of understanding that again Jesus was trying to teach, and even in his day when Jesus was standing there, it wasn't folks weren't necessarily picking it up. And so Arnold's contemplative invitation, I think, is summed up in this poem. Arnold was not only a church historian, not only a churchman in his later days, but Arnold was also a poet and wrote poetry prolifically. And so here's one of Arnold's poems, and I think you will see it calling us beyond thought, beyond sense, beyond self, and into a depth that is contemplative in nature. And here's the poem, True Solitude. Let not your sense scatter this and that. Your spirit must be completely gathered in God. Soul, if you are to rejoice in a deeper peace, enter continually into the one. There you will find an altar and temple to contemplate. There the priest stands continually adorned before God. Leave yourself and your self-centeredness, and you will in the world be freed from the world. The good news is that Arnold's contemplative invitation is for all of us, and you know, the our brethren notion of the priesthood of all believers this will please us. Arnold said that this special union, peace, vision, and perfection is that to which a contemplative is called. And that Arnold believes that this union is not the goal of a few, not something that needs to be mediated through sacraments or through priests, but something that is the necessary direction of all true Christians. Okay. I think this is a good stopping place. Having sort of overviewed Arnold and talked a bit about heart epistemology, I'm gonna pause for a minute, see if I can come back, stop share. Okay. So I'm back on the screen and I'm looking at some of the things that perhaps you all have written. Let's see. One of the genius aspects of the Brethren movement was that it was non-dual in its seeds. Anabaptism and Pietism woven together. We've moved away from that over 2 centuries and have become dualistic in our focus. Yes, I love that, because I do think that in a lot of ways, and I've said this and really believe it, that in a lot of ways we've got the ingredients in our tradition to be non-dual, but it's really hard because that's just not the way that the Western mind and the Western approach really sways us. So yes, Arnold / Hochmann had a huge impact on the first Brethren. Maybe I heard this and I cannot remember, but I wonder when Arnold's thoughts left our roots and why. Susan Smith, could you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, I know I read some of it in Denise Kettering's classes and while I was in Marburg, Germany, but I can't remember. And it's probably in the Pietist option as well. Like, did it just when we came to America, did it sort of end up becoming so much more Anabaptist than Pietist? You know, when do we lose that sort of spiritual sense of, I don't know. And because some people do think it's anti what we are, when it wasn't. So when did it leave and why, you know?
Yeah, that is a good question, and it's one that maybe some of you can speak more to than I can. You know, I think that probably that some of the radical pietists would say that some of this really can't be institutionalized, and the formal church, just by virtue of what it is, can't be a great container for radical pietist spirituality. Does anybody out there have, this may as well be interactive, does anybody out there have thoughts to add there in terms of what Susan has asked, in terms of, I do think one of the dangers that I do think we have is to suggest that Anabaptism has no spirituality. And I think that would be problematic. So I don't want anyone to think that is that, you know, that radical pietism was spiritual, Anabaptism was communal, and that was it. I think it's certainly not that simple. And many of you, I suspect, are better Anabaptist scholars than I. So I just wonder, does anybody have thoughts to share with Susan in this regard?
This is Monica, and so this is maybe, I guess, connected with some of the learnings that I've had about this. But my understanding is in the founding years, and you mentioned, John, and maybe somebody in the comments too, there were a lot of writing back and forth with Anabaptism, which was well established for a couple of hundred years, some Quakers, multiple radical groups. And when the group calling itself the Church of the Brethren, or the followers of Alexander Mack, felt they needed to move from Germany because of the influences there, they moved towards the Anabaptist groups in the north and west parts of Europe, and that at that time was more kind of, they became more closely aligned, and then their movement to the United States. And so maybe there was adoption of theology within that alignment too, because were a lot closer connections instead of just letter writing. So like I said, that's more of a guess than history, but bringing into some of the history, I think.
Yeah, this is Leslie. My guess too is once we got established in the New World and the effort to cloister folks, they were going way off on that. And so my guess is the, established or the institutional church was reacting to that and kind of what was seen as an extremism that took place at Ephrata.
Yeah, that's a good point, Leslie. I just I think they talked about it too in the pietist option about how pietism is not institutional, right? But it's woven throughout. So that's, yeah, thanks.
This is Alan Stuckey. So, I mean, many of you know that I come from a Mennonite tradition. And so my history nerdness goes back a bit farther than the 1700s. The thing that, just a clarifying thing, and this is a case that I would make, I'm sure somebody smarter than me has made it, but in terms of defining what Anabaptism is or was in the late 1600s, early 1700s, one of the things that has to be remembered is that by the time the Brethren showed up, Anabaptism had already shut down into small cloistered areas. That the Anabaptism that existed in the early 1500s was wild. It was. I've heard scholars refer to that period as the Anabaptists in the 1500s as the Pentecostals of the 1500s, right? So that concept of spirituality was very much there at the beginning. And in some ways, my argument would be that what got called Anabaptism and the reason that Pietism needed to come back in is really to replace something that had been lost and that was already there. So the reflection that I would offer on that is, I don't know enough about Brethren development in the US, but from what I know of Mennonite history, the loss of that spirituality can be brought by a whole lot of different things. The institutionalization of the faith, the consolidation of power structures, to focus on right belief or belief statements and things like that, can push out the openness for that spiritual expression. And also, at least in Europe in the 15 and 1600s, the persecution narrative really pushed a lot of that out, in the sense of, okay, please don't kill us and we'll just stay in our own little corner and be quiet. So I think that there's probably not just one, but from my suspicion is that, as with many revival movements, that openness was a lot wider. But then as it becomes codified into some sort of institution or power structure, then the openness is a threat rather than an asset.
Great.
I think, Jonathan, that I have read somewhere that the radical pietists didn't even get along with the Brethren for some of their history before they left Europe and came to America. I do wonder if, adding to the wonderful mix of all the people that have spoken, there is something within surviving persecution and being human that doesn't speak to a distrust of that openness and that lack of discipline and so on. I mean, that's kind of unformed, but that's what I wonder.
Okay, Sonia, can you ask that again? And maybe that last question you posed in maybe a different way.
Well, I was trying to say that I think we as humans sometimes have a little hard knot of wanting everything to be our way, a little hard knot of wanting things in nice, neat order. And that takes us away from that. I guess that's what I was trying to say. That takes us away from that openness to the heart.
Yes, no doubt about that. Okay. Any other hand?
Could I-
Any other-
Could I
Jonathan?
add something? Oh,
Somebody.
This is Francis Hendricks. We don't have a video feed here, but I've been listening and following up what Sonia said. I recently listened to Richard Rohr speak to issues that are too big to fail, issues that are not open to being critiqued, have within them the seeds of the demonic or evil, because we get suspicious then of anything we've got settled. And I think that's always a possibility within any kind of thing that we're trying to codify as this is our belief. And so I think just the fact that we're not always open to being critiqued, that we open ourselves up to being at least unable to listen if unwilling to.
Yes. I totally agree, Francis. And I think that as we move into the rest of this, and I'm sure that Richard Rohr talks about this and talks about it more grace, elegance, accuracy, all those things than I. But Rohr, I think, would suggest that the life of the practice of contemplative prayer, the life of contemplation is meant to unwire us from needing to know all the time. He often says that knowing must be balanced by all knowing must be balanced by unknowing, and all saying must be balanced by unsaying. And I'm sure there are plenty more of those turns of phrase that you could come up with. But you know, there is this, and it's much the division between East and the West, this cataphatic way of knowing versus this apophatic way of knowing. And we are much more happy, especially in the West, with being able to hold on to certainties. And it takes a lot of surrender, and it takes a lot of practice. I might get around to this in this next hour, but if you're a practitioner of centering prayer, then you'll know about this. But Cynthia Bourgeot often talks about that as that practice as exercising our muscles of surrender, and we don't like surrender in our lives, much less in our theology. And so to let go of things that we hold on to really tightly takes a lot of willingness and a lot of openness and a lot of full-heartedness that we just don't access very often. I'm seeing another. Oh, a reminder from Leslie. Just a reminder that you can pick up CEUs, but need to request them in the chat. So there's that.
I have something. This is Kim from Osage Church.
Yeah.
I agree that as at least Western humans, that we do like to have order and discipline and stuff. Some people, but some people, that's not their personality. But I would also say that there are scriptures that back that as well. And there are scriptures that warn against or warn to be disciplined and warn to be careful of your mind and things like that. So I think that there is some basis for some of those feelings of hesitancy as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's also our Western tendency not to want to hold things in tension. And so we live and let live, and strict discipline are two very different ends of a spectrum, neither of which we ought to push too hard toward. So I think you're absolutely right, and that's a good corrective and a good warning for us. let me move us then toward just a few more reflections, specifically about the contemplative life, and about how that offers maybe a different, maybe not a new perspective, but maybe a different accent on matters of faith and matters of life together, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to screen share again and pick back up. Okay. Are we back? Is it there? Okay, great. I like to think of, and I think Cynthia was getting at this when she was talking about the methods that Jesus used to teach. I like to think of Jesus as psychologist in chief. We think of him as the great physician, but he might be the great therapist. I'm not sure, or the great psychologist. At least I think so. Let's see. And so I think what Jesus is often getting at in his teachings is that we humans are by nature people who project. Just about everything we do, well, it is impossible for humans not to operate from their own perspective. It is impossible. We are not blank slates. We do not come at anything without our own biases, without our own prejudices, without our own lens. It's just impossible. And so I think much of what Jesus is trying to get us to do in his Sermon on the Mount, in his parables, is to try to help us clean our lens. And I think that's what the contemplative life works with us to do, is to clean the lens, to help us see through that mirror dimly, maybe a little bit less dimly on this side of the next life. You know, the log versus the speck. You know that you know, Jesus' warning to tend to our own log before we tend to the speck. You know, simply translated, our log skews the way we see the speck in the other. Judge not, lest you be judged. The judgment that we cast on others is the judgment sometimes that we have already cast on ourselves. That's our projection of our own stuff, if you will, onto others. The notion of throwing pearls before swine. We must be careful not to toss spiritual truths in places where they're not ready to be received. Jesus experienced this. And then if you've been following the lectionary lately, you've been dealing with the wheat versus the weeds, where Jesus is suggesting that it is not for us to decide how to deal with the weeds, to let them continue to grow with the wheat, potentially because our judgment is bad. And we might cause more destruction than good by dealing with the weeds in the ways that we think we know best. I want to share this quote by a French philosopher, psychologist, and I think this is important in getting us in talking about that mind-heart space, bridging that gap and sinking into the larger mind, that translation of metanoia that I offered a bit ago. Maurice Nicole says, as your being increases, your receptivity to higher meaning increases. As your being decreases, the old meanings return. I think it is true that as we approach sacred scripture, as we approach a spiritual text, that it is important that we approach it from a spiritual position. I think it is dangerous to come to scripture, to come to spiritual writings that were written from a spiritual position, and to wield those texts without us ourselves being in a place to receive and to rightly engage with those texts. I'll just share that. I had read Philippians many times, but as I several years back had found myself deepening, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this. This is not necessarily a unique experience per se, but as I found myself sinking into a deeper place, into more of a heart space, I came back to that text, and it was on fire in a way that it had not been before, in a way that made sense, and pardon the use of the Western mind word, but in a way that resonated in a way that it had not. And so as my being had increased, my receptivity to that text had shifted. And so I think Jesus tries to warn us against the dangers of using the text in a way that it ought not be, and teaching us to enlarge ourselves as we come to these texts and as we approach them. I think this also has bearing on the notion of the inner word and the outer word, and how we come to Scripture, and how we draw inspiration from Scripture, and how what happens internally connects us with the outer authority of Scripture. Contemplative prayer. We talk about prayer all the time, but prayer in a contemplative posture, I think, is a bit broader. And so I just want to point us to this passage from 1 Thessalonians. Everyone knows this passage, I suspect. The shortest verse in the Bible, yes. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances. The notion of praying without ceasing, I think we have to sort of stop and think about what that means. If we are praying without ceasing, then in this view of prayer, prayer is not necessarily and specifically a conversation. It is not something that we, although it is in this view of prayer, it is not something that we simply sit down quietly and do. Prayer in this view is something bigger, encompassing of, but something bigger than that. And I would offer that it's a mode of being. That prayer is a way of being human. As I mentioned before, Cynthia Bourgeot talks about centering prayer as this constant gesture of surrender, this exercising of our surrender muscles, as she would say. And if we exercise those muscles enough, then we live our lives in a surrendered stance, such that we are practicing the presence of God, such that we are operating from a place of yieldedness, and I'll come to that in a bit, but a place of yieldedness, a place of openness, a place of selflessness that allows us to rejoice always, as the passage says, even when things are not seemingly rejoice worthy, to pray always, even when we are not seated or in a quiet space, and to give thanks in all circumstances, even when those circumstances would not elicit thanks. If we come at that passage from a mind place, then it will be rendered to us impossible. If we come to that passage that's listed there from a deeper place of being and being sustained and staying, then I think we start to get into what real contemplative prayer does to us, and how it transforms us and reprograms us to be. And so contemplative prayer then becomes a way of viewing reality, a way of sensing reality, of understanding reality, and of responding to reality. I said I'd come back to obedience a bit ago, and I think the notion of obedience gets a bad rap. Let's face it, none of us like to be told what to do. One of the real challenges for the church today is the modern and postmodern distrust of authority. No one wants to ascribe to authority outside of themselves, and so the authority that the church once wielded pretty freely, and perhaps for the better, for reinvention is reinvention is maybe a necessity now, but we don't much like to ascribe to any authority outside of ourselves and outside of our own personality. But in the contemplative tradition, the word obedience really means listening from below. That's what that word and what its constituent parts really mean. And we hear Jesus often talking to us and admonishing, saying, especially alongside his parables, "He who has ears, let him hear." And so if I can find it, I want to read you a bit of a reflection on this notion of hearing, this notion of listening, which leads us to a different sort of obedience. This is from that wisdom sermon that I quoted a bit earlier, the Vindication of Wisdom. "Pay attention to how you listen," says Jesus, "and let anyone with ears hear," which presumes that not everyone has acquired these ears. I am sometimes asked how the contemplative life can be reconciled with the gospel imperative to seek and to do justice. To me, there is nothing to reconcile here. If contemplative listening is authentic, God will be heard. The conscience, heart, mind, inner knowledge, the conscience will be moved, and the need of the suffering other will become clear, or will prompt further listening and a refined set of questions. If you are in the habit of listening to people, you will know the discipline it can take to remain centered in that primary stance of wholehearted presence and availability without succumbing to the secondary layers of our own commentary, our desire to rescue or problem solve, or even the subtle temptation to augment another's ego. This discipline is wisdom's yoke. Wielded as a tool, it cannot be other than a tool for justice. And I saw Vicky smiling over there because I know that Vicky has done a lot with reconciliation and problem solving and listening, and I think he says it right there. We don't know how to listen to one another very well, much less listen to silence or listen to the depths of God very well. And so obedience, this notion of obedience as obeying, simply as following a set of rules, is a little bit short-sighted. Our obedience instead comes from a deep listening, where we're not ready to react. We're not ready to latch on and cling to answers before they come. I mentioned before this notion of yieldedness, this notion of Gelassenheit in the German. And I want to pull back in Scott Holland's paper on this. This is his Hochmann, Alexander Mack, his set of theses. And he talks about this Gelassenheit, this yieldedness, which Hochmann would have subscribed to, Scott Holland is suggesting. He first says that yieldedness has been used in a variety of ways, but here's the way that Hochmann, he suggests, would have subscribed or come to Gelassenheit. And he comes through the German mystic Meister Eckhart. And he says the medieval German mystic Meister Eckhart used Gelassenheit or yieldedness to signify an interior, soulful yielding to God by way of encounter with the divine, often bypassing the mediation of institutionally sanctioned holy words, bypassing exterior holy things, bypassing official holy people, and bypassing ornate holy places. And so that's the Gelassenheit that he's suggesting that Hochmann would have sent us toward. Which I want to suggest, perhaps boldly, that this deep listening changes the way we think about obedience. It changes the way we think about morality. That morality being less about striving and more about gift. Less about working hard to do what's right, and more about receiving morality and perfection, if you will, or movement toward this divine nature from God. Now, I don't want to suggest that there is again, I don't want us to get into a dualistic place. I think we can hold these two things together. But I think we have to think of listening to and heeding God's voice as something given to us, as something that is a fruit. Else we travel down a legalistic spiral. And so it's a thinking of obedience, and it's a different way of thinking of faithfulness. But I think it's a much more grace-filled, much more spirit-filled orientation of the notion of morality and ethics than perhaps we like to think of. And so then I think that leads us to maybe another dangerous place, the notion of contemplative freedom. I've already mentioned that authority is hard for us. And I think Hochmann and Alexander Mack figured it out relatively quickly. And I think the rub became apparent. And Scott Holland, in this article that I've continued to reference, suggests this about Hochmann's view. He says, Hochmann, rejecting this order of discipline that Mack was establishing, was marked more by spiritualism and mysticism for the cultivation of the individual and inspired heart. Hochmann preached that the freedom of Christ suffers neither force nor laws. A theology of personal conscience, listening to one's heart, and no force in religion are central themes in Hochmann's homiletics. Now, I want to be careful and to suggest that I don't think that this means we are sucked into moral relativism or simply following the whims of our own personality and the whims of our own wills and desires. I don't think that that's what Hochmann is getting at, and I certainly don't think that's what contemplative freedom is. Instead, I would suggest that we should. Let me make this statement, that there is a certain tyranny in personality. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. In that we like to think of our own personhood, our own identifications, our own wants, our own wanderings, our own desires, and sometimes we label them as conscience, and sometimes we follow them. But I want to suggest, and I'll come back around to this a little bit later, that there is that much of personality obscures us from our genuine nature. And so I don't want to suggest that this freedom from force and law is instead a live and let live permission, a permission to follow our own ways and our own wants. It is not that. Thomas Merton, like I said, I'll reference this again in a bit. Thomas Merton has suggested that contemplation would lead us from a phony individualism to a genuine collectivity. From a phony individualism to a genuine collectivity. And so don't think of freedom as freedom of self. Think of freedom as freedom from self. And suddenly we are catapulted into a different way of being free, a way that's way beyond legalism, where the law is hemming us in, but also way beyond personal conscience, to something much deeper, something more sustaining, and something that gives us freedom in a much different way. The last piece, the last sort of contemplative reframing that I want to do is for something that we talk about a lot, forbearance. This notion that we will wait patiently until we are of one mind, that we are not yet of one mind on issue X or issue Y, and so we will wait patiently for that one-mindedness. I want to sort of reframe what that one-mindedness would mean to the contemplative. A quote again by Cynthia Bourgeault, that sort of frees up and demystifies or demyths a little bit of contemplation or the contemplative life. She says that the goal of contemplation is to quiet the superficial mind, which we've talked about, the dividing mind, the dualistic mind, so that the deep mind can kick in. The deep mind, the mind of Christ, I would say, Philippians, the deep mind that knows that everything in this universe is connected to everything else. The realization that in this interconnected world, we are held absolutely responsible for loving and valuing and cherishing all parts of it. So contemplation, properly understood, begins to affect that isolated, separate mind, that personality, if you will, pulling you deeper, or pulling you into the deeper mind where you realize that you are at one with all minds. This is real forbearance, I think. And then impels you back into the world in enlightened, free action. So really, for those that know contemplation, these things are deeply reinforcing. It is only the superficial, stereotypical image that contemplation is a quiet lifestyle that is causing trouble both inside the church and outside it. Richard Rohr has said of the name of his center in Albuquerque, the Center for Action and Contemplation. He said that the most important word in that title is the word "and," simply because one does not come without the other. In fact, I suspect he would agree that if you really wanted, you could title it the Center for Contemplation, and it would be unavoidable that would also mean the Center for Action, because the contemplative life is without action, not the contemplative life. It is just that simple, that the fruit of contemplation is action. And so I want to return all the way back and pick up the piece that I had written that I left off with way back at the beginning, where I suggested, let me pick up a few sentences before where I stopped. Indeed, contemplation is traditionally described as a stance of surrender, a posture in which one makes himself in solitude and stillness available to God. Language like this has often led bystanders to misunderstand contemplation as an introvert's paradise, or as the process by which men and women become too heavenly minded for earthly good. And this is where I stopped. But the wager of contemplation is much greater. In discussing the Benedictine Father John Main's main thesis, that the monk, the contemplative, is an archetype or a part in every human being, The text goes on to explain that, quote, all of us human beings have a capacity for God, a capacity to be drawn by God into the depths of our own being, where we experience the presence of God, of the infinite, eternal reality that sustains the world as the ground and source of our being, end quote. Herein lies the truth about contemplation, and I would argue about the radical pietist approach. A truth that deserves a warning sign for all who dare to enter the arena. The loosing of oneself and surrender to a God who is in all and through all inevitably leads the isolated individual, that personality, into a radically reoriented place of communion on a local, global, and even cosmic sense. Again, this Thomas Merton's phony individualism versus genuine collectivity, Here, the two greatest commands are bound together. They are not that being love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor. They are not a 1-2 punch of Christian behavior, not a 2-step process of summing up the laws. Instead, they conceal, I think, a deep spiritual message that loving God with a surrendered self, in the contemplative sense of surrender, loving God with a surrendered self leads inevitably to a love for neighbor as self, wherein self is no longer the isolated individual, but now a self fully immersed in the Trinitarian flow of God's love. What seems initially a diminishment of self is the narrow gate through which one discovers the truest, most realized, most connected self. The more one sinks into God, the more one is compelled into community, into action that builds community. This stirring into God's movement is the very fruit of contemplation. And so I would suggest that this loving of God with the whole body, not just the mind, with the heart, soul, mind, and strength, necessarily results in loving the neighbor as self, not loving the neighbor as much as self. I think we often want to think of it as, I love God, I love myself, and now I love my neighbor. But a love of God reorients self altogether, such that the self is not the personality. The self is not the identifications that we have picked up along the way as we've decided who we are. The self, rather, is something dynamic. The self is something that doesn't exist without the next self. My brother, my sister, the one particularly weaker, more susceptible, more frail, more marginalized than I am. And in this sort of way of seeing self, community is inevitable. Community is born of contemplation. And so, to conclude, I suppose, a world in trouble, this world of ours, needs the balm of contemplation. But so does a denomination at a reformative crossroads. And so I would submit that contemplative spirituality, epitomized in that radical pietism of Arnold, of Hochmann, that perhaps got sidelined, that contemplative spirituality can provide the blueprint to radically repietize our Anabaptist leanings, that it has the tools to unleash the spiritual potential of the Church of the Brethren's already dual radical pietist and Anabaptist inheritance. Together, we can point out the flaws of our Anabaptist way of being God's people, and confess that the spiritual riches of radical pietism can be a driving force for restoration and renewal. This renewal can be our denomination's unique gift to the world, our most abiding way of fulfilling the call of our proposed and developing vision statement. We can carry Jesus into the neighborhood, as it were, only when we have laid everything else down, only after we have come heart to heart with God. Otherwise, that which we carry into the neighborhood will be a tagline without transformation, a slogan without stamina, a mantra without meaning. Contemplation rightly understood, humbly sought, and fully realized is the catalyst for community and the vessel from which and out of which flow peace, justice, redemption, and salvation. It will kindle our hearts to burn with God's flame. It will compel us to raise our banners high in this hour. It will stir us to build new worlds in God's name. And so may it be so. So that takes me to the end of what I have to share with you, and would love to hear reflections, feedback, conversation, criticism, critiques. I'm just now seeing through some of these comments that came. But those of you who listed comments there, feel free to voice them aloud now in these last moments of our time together.
Well, and Jonathan, while you're looking through that, I would just also say hi. This is our pastor leader training for this year, and I'm excited to see so many people. I think about 50 signed in, and I know there are a lot of couples present. So just as when we do CEUs for the pre-conference sessions, and you have to sign in order to actually get the CEUs, that's what we're doing here, and we're hoping folks will do that through the chat. And if you've never done that, it's a little, if you hover kind of at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a thing that says chat. Right now, I know there are, like I said, probably 30 or 40 of you here are eligible, but only 5 have actually done that so far. So please do that. Vicki and Gail, you get a pass since you're moderator and moderator-elect. So, but, and I guess maybe Sonia as staff. But I need to hear from the rest of you so I can give you, yeah. So if you're messaging Joanna privately, I don't know how you got 17, Joanna, but I'm the one, I think I'm the one tracking this. But if you get either one of us, we'll get you. That's my final announcement and reminder about that. And thanks.
Alan, do you want to, I see your note about the compelling vision. I know you've worked on that a lot. Do you want to you want to speak to the point you made?
I mean, no, but I'm pretty tired when it comes to that.
Understand.
But I mean, that, don't mistake that for my belief in that in the process. But
no.
But no, just that I mean, we basically unleashed that in February, and it's been an interesting process to watch people grasp onto a lot of different things. And boy, howdy, do people see what they want to in it. When there is far more than you think is in it, quite frankly. But one of the phrases that I have, the way it's a nuanced thing, but I have heard some people talk about that phrase as though, quite frankly, it's the old colonial sense of, we are bringing Jesus to those people over there. And that is not what we meant. We are carriers of Jesus, but we also very much are meeting Jesus, who is already at work in the neighborhood, and our task is to see that. And so just as y'all have conversations about that and try and figure out what you think about it, that's just one that, and some of that is, like, I'm a pastor, I have a dog in this fight, but right, like, that one's important to me. So that's a both and. That's not an either or situation. And so just to be clear that that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.
Jonathan, one of the things we're getting a lot of requests for is to know if we can have copies of your PowerPoints.
Yeah, let me dress them up a little bit and actually add a bibliography, so that it's not just a bunch of random words that don't mean very much, or at least that I like for them to mean as much as they already mean. So let me
a lot, but
let me work on getting some stuff actually cited, and that would probably be better all the way around. But of course. Anything else?
I just thought the way you brought it together was really powerful. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Sonia.
Jonathan, this is Chris Whitaker, right here.
Hey, Chris.
I was, when you were talking there towards the end about contemplation leading to action, what was coming to my mind was writings in James, faith without works. And I'm wondering, is that a subtext? Is there a parallel? Is there anything to be made of that kind of language in text?
You know, there is, see if I can find it. There was one, just as I was stumbling around, like I was talking about at the very beginning of this talk, I ran into, I'm sure many of you have read this, into the spring 2017 issue of the Brethren, Life and Thought magazine. There was an article in it by Dan Poole about Gottfried Arnold. That article that I referenced by Steve Schweitzer on conscience and covenant was in there. But what I'm looking for is, Chris, is specific reference in one of these articles to faith and works. And it is in Dan Poole's article about Pietism's influence on the Brethren development. And Dan says this, give me just a second. He says, for early Christians, the test for who was worthy of bearing the name of Jesus was a rather straightforward and simple one. Either one was godly in their countenance and their life bore the fruit of the Spirit, or they were ungodly and this was evidenced by their captivity to sin. This formulation puts together the two planks of Christian practice that were extremely important to the early Brethren movement, faith and works. In fact, argues Miller, who he's citing, it may just be this equal concentration of both facets, faith and works, which truly distinguishes the Brethren from other Protestant forms. So that your question brought that to mind, but I thought that was an interesting point that he makes about that tension that we often think we have to take sides, it's faith or works. And so. Yeah, I see the ora et labora, prayer and work, and some of the Benedictine references or quotes that I was drawing out earlier. That was Connie. Thanks for bringing that up. That's the Benedictine way is prayer and work.
I think some of that dualism comes into play with even thinking about the social gospel or this. It just becomes either you are telling them, being evangelistic, or you're helping them. And we shouldn't think this has to be just an either or to me. One thing I wanted to ask people, I did 2 sermons based on the Pietist option, and one which I think was the most important for the Church of the Brethren right now, is the theme of unity. And there was so much offered in this book about how we can not just forbear each other, but like the title of my sermon was, Will We Answer the Prayer of Jesus and Stay Together? And I know it's probably not going to happen, but there was a lot of good stuff in the pietist option. So does anybody have thoughts on our pietism, what it could offer us in our unification, staying together?
This is Gail Erisland Valletta. I would say that forbearance is the word that has many red flags for some people and many hopeful flags for others. But I would like to reclaim the word forbearance as Jonathan is suggesting. And if we are in our time, then it's not enough. It's not fast enough. If it's in God's time, maybe the timing is up to God, not to us. So maybe that's the piece. If we could work with that, I would be very thrilled as a denomination.
My response to Susan about the pietist option, because I think it was Sonia who recommended that, and I read it and was quite taken by it. And the sense of, it's not so much right belief as it is, what's your journey with Jesus, rather than a kind of checklist of, I believe this, I don't believe that. It's the connection and the support of walking with each other, no matter where we are. My ears are hearing one thing and your ears are hearing something else. What in the world is going on here? And what does that mean? And so how do we as a community, a faith community, listen and hear and support and grow and challenge without having to be judgmental about the belief or the doctrinal concept?
You know, briefly, Joanna, I see your mention of Rohr about Anabaptists getting it right. And so Rohr gives the Anabaptists lots of street credibility, that's for sure. But Rohr would say, Vicky, back to what you were saying, except I just lost my train. Rohr talks about often the fact that we live ourselves into right ways of thinking, into right ways of believing. Rarely do we believe ourselves into right ways of living. And so I don't know if it's in the pietist option or not, that talks about reorienting that, the three B's, believing, behaving, belonging, turning them around to belonging, behaving, believing. And that's right. That's exactly what Rohr is getting at with living your way into new modes of understanding, versus this other way around, which is always going to be mind driven. It's always going to be a striving, which is of the mind, and probably more often than not ego based, not spirit based. That's a broad generalization, and those things are dangerous, but nonetheless.
I'd like to read something that deals with this, and it says the ethos of pietism embedded into the Church of the Brethren should know there are fresh movements of the Spirit, and that too much dependence on doctrine leads to dead orthodoxy rather than an alive Holy Spirit who guides us in new and freshing ways. So we know Scripture is timeless, and the pietist ethos calls us to expect transformation when we read that. And so this dead orthodoxy versus this fresh movements of the Spirit is what just intrigues me so much. And they quoted Stott, who said, we need to know God with prepositions, not propositions. So it's saying the same thing you've been saying, but I love the way it was said in that book.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great stuff.
Well, I'm the one who invited Jonathon to speak and share, and I am really, really glad to have had this time with you, Jonathon. And I appreciated your Gottfried Arnold quotes and information, and I loved the parts about wisdom, as well as obedience, and of course, heart. So we are limited on time. This is one big time glitch that I'll take credit for, because at the top of the